He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're going to be diving back into some Bigfoot encounters, followed up by some statistics that were published not too long ago this year. But before we get into that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as our Patreon, where you can get ad-free, exclusive early content there. I also want to shout out a recent episode that Ruben worked very hard on, the Haunt of the Grassman. This is our campaign-styled series that we're tackling, where basically Ruben has built this story from the ground up, focusing on Bigfoot and other cryptids that I'm basically going in and exploring using D&D 5th edition rules. Our second episode is being worked on and will be dropping on our Patreon feed, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Additionally, if you want to say hi, send us a message, you can reach us at cryptidclues@gmail.com. But without further ado, let's get into this. So our first encounter, it took place in 2015, in July. And I'm going to recite here and quote unquote the entire thing. So, starting now, a potential encounter in Humboldt Redwood State Park, California, Albee Creek Campground. My wife and I and our two fearless Chihuahua mixed brothers, they have some beagle in them, went on our first family camping trip up the California coast and up to Oregon. My wife had never camped in a tent before, and neither had the two dogs. I used to be a hardy camper, but middle age takes over and that sleeping bag is awfully uncomfortable, even with an air mattress. We drove up from Southern California, and our first destination was the Humboldt Redwood State Park, just off the coast. And it was for just one night before moving on. We were able to snag a camping spot in the Albee Creek campground there, which had a nice separation between each spot, and each camping site had a bear-proof storage box, campfire ring, and a picnic table. Flush toilets and paid showers around 50 yards away, pretty standard. After setting up our 4-person tent, dogs are people, we had time to explore before making dinner over the campfire. Directly behind the tent is an old tree stump, about 3 feet high, from a long ago chopped tree. My wife leaned against it, and we pondered how long ago this tree was cut. Probably a decade or two ago at least. More on this later. After a fine gourmet steak dinner, you have to live it up, especially since I had Boy Scout acquired cooking skills over a fire from my youth. We cleaned up and stored all food in the bear-proof metal container outside. Inside the tent, the two dogs had their little beds between our sleeping bags. Sometime in the middle of the night, I think it was 2 or 3 a.m. I'm not sleeping all that great, trying to find a comfortable position, and my wife nudges me hard and starts whispering that something is touching her. I quietly roll over and saw in the dark that something was touching her head through the tent wall and moved away as it probably heard us. This is probably 6 to 10 inches above the ground. She's telling me quietly to go out there and see what it is? No way. We had a partial moon that night, so it was dark, but just a bit of light was out, so it was not a completely dark night. I told her to stay quiet and stay still. She had moved away slightly from the tent wall already. The two dogs, who bark at any person, dog, cat, squirrel, possum, or raccoon, we have a few animals that visit our little backyard at home which the dogs bark at, are shivering badly and not making a sound. They are curled up between my wife's legs and trying to get inside her sleeping bag. What great guard dogs, huh? After a short time, we heard something moving away in the leaves gently, but could not tell if it was big or small. We never heard any other sounds or smelled anything. I went out of the tent about 15 to 20 minutes later with my flashlight and did not see anything, of course. Figured to shine the light all around to let anyone know that I was out of the tent. The neighboring camping trailer was probably about 90 to 100 feet away behind the tree stump I mentioned earlier. Partially visible in between trees and shrubs, they had no lights on. There was no camping spot in the other direction for a longer distance. The people camping across the road were probably about 80 to 100 feet away, and I did not see any lights on there either. The next morning was weird. We got no sleep that night, obviously, and we were kind of dragging. Made some coffee and started packing up our gear. Did not see any footsteps on the ground in the area behind the tent, but the soil was hard packed. But on that tree stump I mentioned earlier was several small polished rocks, river rocks I assumed, that were not there the evening before. Our neighbors next door might have walked through and left them there for some reason. We did not see any kids next door, just a couple of adults, or something else could have. We stopped by the ranger booth to hand in our camping pass, and I asked the middle-aged gentleman about what types of animals were in the area. He said that bears do wander in on occasion, but it's rare nowadays since they got poached outside the park quite often. He's not seen a bear or bear scat around the Albee area for a year or two at least. He said that they had the usual deer and some elk not far away nearby, but they rarely come into the campground, meaning the elk, and of course, all of the usual small mammals such as squirrels, raccoons, and foxes. I asked him if any of these would come near the tent since something touched my wife through the tent wall. He just smiled and shrugged his shoulders and did not say a word. End of conversation. If it would have been any of those small animals, the two dogs would have gone nuts barking, as they do in our backyard when cats, squirrels, possums, and raccoons walk along the cinder block tall wall just to torture the dogs, I'm sure. So, I make no claims on what happened, but it is not explainable under the circumstances due to the dogs shivering in fear, not making a noise, and not barking at whatever it was. Hope you enjoyed the story. End quote. Now, I found this fascinating, and again, I have to thank you very much for allowing me to share the story. I want to say and speak to a little bit where leaving of items behind, this is something I've looked into and I've read in many other encounters before where someone will come across a Bigfoot and almost as if it's a trade, but primarily they will leave something in a prominent place that they suspect you'll find it. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure what it means. It's something I've discussed with Ruben offcast, but we've talked about how it could be a territorial thing, it could be a sentimental thing. It's still unsure what it could really be implying, but it varies. Where it's rocks, where it's sticks, where it's actual animal remains or carcasses, it definitely varies on what is left behind. When I was reading through this, I felt like there was a much more sincere notion attached to it, and then the whole experience of something pushing through the tent wall. Again, this is definitely not the first time I have read about this and spoken to individuals that have claimed that this has occurred, and it just seems to be, I don't know if it would be a lack of concept as, okay, there's something here and there's something inside. Like, I'm sure the intelligence is there to understand that it's like a little hut of sorts, maybe like an equivalent to what they would create a little tree hut with branches and such. But maybe it's just at the end of the day, it's just they can't distinguish what they're pushing their hand against. Like, oh, they're startled because there's something inside there. There's a person. They can smell you, but then they can't see you. It's kind of like tricking an animal, so to speak, an illusion, you could say. And I'm wondering if that's kind of what was implied here, where this thing it was pressing up against, and it's like, okay, there's clearly a person here, but it just got startled because it couldn't figure out and couldn't come to terms with it. Now, this is not the first time when it comes to park rangers and individuals that work at these campsites and in national parks where they know something, but they don't really allude to it. Of course, they don't want it to be a media frenzy, and most of the time they're going to allude to a bear. However, I do find it fascinating that just this person just kind of carried on, didn't really get fazed by it. It just kind of makes me feel like, as it was described in this encounter, that, okay, something has reoccurred here a few times, and maybe it is on a more sincere note, and this person has a more compassionate relationship with what's going on or what is lurking out there, and just kind of lets it be, gives it its space, and gets that same respect in return. Some sort of like symbiotic relationship of sorts. I'm not sure if symbiotic is the correct term for that, but that's just kind of my thoughts. I wanted to input it. But again, a fascinating encounter, and it makes me feel very kind of humble too. You have the situation as well with the dogs that were not reacting to it. Little dogs like to go crazy, almost like they like to compensate for like being little tiny things. No, they make up for it with their power stance and their loud barks and everything like that. I've met a few ruckus rousers in my day that are little chihuahuas. So to put them in a position where they can't necessarily see, but they can sense that something is there, and they know that this thing is not to be messed around with, that's pretty potent. I went camping not too long ago, and there was an individual next to us in the campsite that had a dog with them, and there'd be the slightest little like kerfuffle outside as we're walking around at night, and they would huff and they would try to bark and everything like that. But to make a dog be put in a situation where they go against their instinct like that, it must be a pretty powerful energy or being to be able to output that frequency that a dog can pick up and not instinctively react to. But I digress. So again, fascinating encounter. Thank you very much for allowing me to share it. I have another one that I'm going to get into, and this one takes place in Arundel County. Now, the Arundel police, I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's a very spunky word. Arundel. Arundel. The Arundel policeman. Workers track roaming 12-foot creature. August 1st, 2000. And Arundel County Police looked for a mysterious 12-foot creature yesterday, but it's unclear whether an officer and witnesses spotted an animal, or maybe they joked, the imaginary Loch Ness monster from the Severn River. A police department spokesman confirmed a report of a strange sighting in Hanover just after midnight yesterday near the Arundel Mills Mall construction site. But witnesses said the 12-foot tall upright black thing ran past them so fast they weren't sure what it was. Construction workers who were napping in a van had called police after they had claimed to have seen the 12-foot tall hairy figure with glowing red eyes running swiftly along the property perimeter. A dispatched off-duty officer working security at the mall site was sent out to investigate. The workers, who had fled to a nearby fast food restaurant for safety, were reluctant to return to the construction site with the officer, said Sergeant Joseph Jordan. But the workers finally agreed to show the officer where they had seen the creature. And after a brief search, the officer found a footprint about 15 to 20 inches long, Jordan said. Officers contacted the State Department of Natural Resources, which reported a recent sighting of 2 bears near Interstate 295. However, the print seemed rather large and long for a bear print, police said. When the workers and the officer later caught another glimpse of what appeared to be the animal near a pond, also on the site, the workers ran, police said. The off-duty officer stayed and reported seeing 2 animal-like eyes in the dark, though he couldn't tell what it was, police said. In case the creature was a bear, the officer continued to stay in the area it was last seen, occasionally shining his spotlight around the pond. About 3 a.m., the officer saw what appeared to be an animal lying on a hill near the pond, though it's unclear whether it was the same animal spotted earlier. The officer blew an air horn several times, but it didn't jerk or move at all. Police do not believe it was a person. It had fur, but whatever it was disappeared before they could get close enough and solve what this was. So, again, this blows my mind because you get those intricate little details like, okay, it's hairy, it's furry, red eyes as well. So we have the foundations of a hairy cryptid of sorts. I mean, very well could have been a dog man for all we know, but there is something that was bipedal maneuvering through here with glowing red eyes and hair. And the more I looked into it, so these construction workers, basically they had to camp out in their van on the job site because, again, they hadn't been paid yet. There weren't proper accommodations set up while they were working, and it just happened to just be, open the door to the van, just go around 12 a.m., go into the bathroom, and sure enough, boom, there it is, walking along the perimeter. So that's how quick this usually is. It's just a fascinating boom. it happens. But again, that's just an encounter I wanted to share because I thought that was very fascinating. Before we continue on to our next encounter, I'm going to jump to a quick ad break, so we will be right back. And we're back. So, Lon Strickler's encounter. This is May 9th, 1981 at around 10 a.m. While out fly fishing for smallmouth bass on the southmost branch of the Patapsco River near Sykesville, Maryland, Mr. Strickler caught a glimpse of a hairy creature. Having noticed a stray dog sniffing around on the northern bank some 50 yards away from his position, a few minutes passed and the dog started to growl and bark. Thinking this was simply a deer, it wasn't until Mr. Strickler looked up and noticed a large hairy figure bobbing up and down in the brush. He stopped fishing and moved as close as he could to the ruckus for a better look. The dog at this time stopped barking, quiet, until all of a sudden the dog let out a yelp, and this creature stood up, clocking in at around 7 to 8 feet tall with dark matted hair. Only seeing the chest up due to the brush obscuring the rest of its body, Mr. Strickler stood completely still, watching as this creature began to stroll off towards the deeper woods. Eventually, Mr. Strickler began to follow it and noted the powerful scent that emanated from it. As he put it, a fox urine smell. As it eventually moved out of sight, being notably faster than himself, he decided to return to his car and head to town to make a report. He did notice, however, the dog and saw it had blood around its neck and hind area, but was still mobile. After calling the police from a payphone, Mr. Strickler was directed to return to the area to meet them there, which he did. Now, upon arriving, a state officer was already there and directed him to stay in his vehicle and eventually leave altogether. After returning about an hour later to the area, Mr. Strickler could see the place was crawling with officers. One man nearby reported that they had found hair samples but refused to mention anything else. There were some reports that the local officers closed off the area so that government teams could come in, who were very well equipped in terms of helicopters and weaponry, and soon enforced all the state officers to disband the area. But it's still speculated that throughout the early 1980s that this Patapsco River area was actually a large encounter spot before it became currently a zoned residential area. So again, we have this whole take on what could have been a nest of Sasquatch, and the government came in, found out, okay, there's a lot going on here. We have a lot of evidence to prove that something is existing here, and we need to eliminate this. So we have a whole hunting party set up to go in, remove this nest, and basically wipe out all the evidence so no one else is going to have any problems here. And I feel like this is something that happens consistently and reoccurringly throughout history, where these people experience something and they make that call, because who else are you going to call? You're going to dial 911, you're going to call the authorities, because there's no proper way to go about this. And the authorities are a direct connection to the powers to be up there that have access and the means to deal with these situations in a very negative way, unfortunately. And for whatever the reason, they want to keep it hidden, which is something me and Ruben will be talking a little bit more about in the future. But again, a fascinating thing. There's so many more details surrounding that, where it's fascinating how the time that it took for Mr. Strickler to actually get back to that area was about 3 minutes, and the state trooper was already there. It just makes me feel like they have a pre-existing knowledge that, okay, we need to be concerned about this area. Maybe they were watching and waiting for someone to report something, to go in and just confirm it, eliminate all the evidence. It's fascinating, and there's a lot of perspectives you can form on that. But to kind of steer us into the end of this episode, I found an interesting article that was detailing statistics of Bigfoot belief. And this is a comparison since 2020 to 2022. And I quote, "Bigfoot belief has actually been on the rise since 2020 in the United States." So in a civic science survey that was conducted in mid-July, 13% of United States adults said they agree with the statement, Bigfoot Sasquatch is a real living creature. And this is up from 11% who said the same thing in May 2020, seeing an 18% increase. Americans living in the West were still more likely to believe in Bigfoot. 15% of residents in the West are believers compared to 11% in the Northeast, but the hike in Sasquatch believers is coming from cities and suburb areas. Rural Americans hadn't really budged on their belief of Bigfoot in 2022 compared to 2020, but it is worth noting that both the Midwest and South clocked in at 13%. Now, to take this a step further, It seems ages 35 to 54 saw the highest increase in the belief of Bigfoot, jumping from 12% to 15% over the past 2 years. Ages 13 to 34 went from 11% to 14%, and ages 55 and older went from 10% to 11%. Again, this is a comparison from the year 2020 to 2022. Statistics also show that 59% of people that go into the woods and national parks consistently agree and believe that Bigfoot is real, along with 41% of people that rarely or never go into the woods or national parks as well stand for Bigfoot being real. This stacks up against 51% of those who go into the woods and national parks not believing in Bigfoot, with 49% of people who don't go into the woods or national parks as well not believing in Bigfoot. Now, conspiracies certainly did take an interest throughout the pandemic times, but is that all that can be attributed to this? Simply online conspiracies and such? I don't think so, and I propose a different concept to that. When things started to close up everywhere during pandemic time, many people, myself included, went to the woods, camping, hiking, and really immersing yourself in nature when the local city life was inaccessible. This massive increase and influx of humans entering and progressing into the woods probably resulted in a major uptick of overall sightings and just general belief that, hey, the woods are immensely massive and something very well could exist out here, hidden from us particularly. So this increase in Bigfoot belief isn't the only thing on the rise, however. A lot of discussions have been coming forward from the government regarding frequent sightings with UFOs occurring more often and often, attributing it also towards underwater and different levels of the atmosphere sightings as well. But I digress now. This is the same, however, with Bigfoot. As we keep expanding into their turf, there is still no shortage of hiding places in the woods of the Pacific Northwest or the caves below. But with that, that's where I'm going to end this episode. I want to say thank you very much for tuning in. Again, you can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can find us on our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And again, on that Patreon, we get ad-free exclusive early episodes. If you want to say hi or shoot us an email, you can do so at our Gmail, cryptidclues@gmail.com. And until next time, stay safe and take care, everyone.